Hello, hello, Year 10, and welcome back to English as we carry on looking at our anthology poetry. Yesterday, you did an introduction to Romanticism to prepare you for the next 4 poems that we'll be covering in the next couple of weeks. All right. Today is Tuesday, the 23rd of February, 2021, and today's title is Extract from the Prelude, Part 1. That's the next poem we are going to be focusing on. But the first thing for you to do today, we have a retrieval quiz here on the screen that I'd like you to have a go at. Question number 1, what is Romanticism? Question number 2, during what time period did Romanticism occur? Number 3, what is the definition of sublime? Number 4, how does Ware's use of a dramatic monologue contribute to the poem in Poppies? Number 5, the charge of the Light Brigade is written in dactylic metre. What does this represent? Okay, I want you to pause the video here, have a go at answering all 5 of those questions. Take about 5 minutes if you need to. Refer back to your notes if needed. All right, but the whole aim of this is to pull that information out from the back of our brains and just to reinforce the connections and help with long-term retention. So pause the video, have a go at the questions. I'll go through the answers in a moment. Okay, looking at the answers for those then. Question number 1 was, what is Romanticism? So Romanticism, also known as the Romantic Era, was an artistic, literary, musical and intellectual movement that originated in Europe toward the end of the 18th century. Number 2, during what time period did Romanticism occur? Between 1800 and 1850, thereabouts, okay? There were instances of romantic poems slightly before this time, okay? But as you'll see with this poem today, it was that kind of poetry that began to spur the movement. Number 3, what is the definition of sublime? Something that is sublime is of very great excellence or beauty. That's that key word that we looked at yesterday. Number 4, how does Weir's use of a dramatic monologue contribute to the poem in Poppies? It reinforces that the poem is designed to be conveying the effects of conflict on those left at home. We're solely looking at the perspective of the mother, all right, not those at war, okay? So again, it reinforces that perspective. Number 5, the charge of the Light Brigade is written in dactylic metre. What does this represent? Okay, so remember, dactylic metre is when you get a stressed syllable followed by 2 unstressed syllables. So it's dum-da-dum, half a league, half a league, half a league, onward. All right, and the regular rhythm reflects the charge itself, all right, as well as the sound of soldiers dropping as part of the fight, okay, that emphasis on certain syllables within the words there. All right, so edit any answers you need to. If you've got them correct, well done. All right, if you need to pause the video here to check those answers, absolutely fine. All right, but I am going to carry on. So again, today we're looking at the extract from the Prelude, Part 1, okay? I will quickly note that copies of all of the romantic poems are once again attached on Show My Homework, so you're probably going to need that if you can print them off, I would highly advise doing so, but you're going to want to be able to annotate the poem in some way. So whether you print it to annotate, whether you upload or download the document onto your computer and make edits there, or make your annotations on the computer in Microsoft Word, or however you may choose to do it, absolutely fine. Or if you need to, you might want to write the poem down and make annotations around it like that. Okay, but today's aims are to understand some contextual details about the poet, all right, to understand what the poem is about and to explore the form and structure of the poem. We're taking the same lesson structure as we have done to the other poems in the past. Okay, we'll look at form and structure today. We'll do language tomorrow, because language is always the chunkier part of the poetry analysis. And just before we begin, I just thought I'd show you this quickly once again, just as a reminder to be small with your notes. All right, make sure you do leave plenty of space. You should be able to get everything you need to write onto the copy of the poem. Again, you'd normally have an anthology that looks a bit like this, minus the scribbles, okay, and you'd be adding those notes to it. And it's a case of just ensuring that as we move through form, structure and language, you're just leaving enough space, because there's probably going to be something else we're going to want to add. And once again, the blue annotate cloud will appear on slides where you do need to be writing something down. Some key terminology to begin with today then. All right, I want you to please add these terms to the glossary that you've slowly been creating over the last poetry lessons. You've hopefully been building up that table full of key terminology terms, because there are so many different terms that we come back to and revisit over and over, okay? It's really, really useful for you to have this bank of information. So I'd like to add these terms to it, all right? So first of all, we've got an epic poem, which is a long narrative poem that is usually about heroic deeds and events that are significant to the culture of the poet. Many ancient writers used epic poetry to tell tales of dramatic events involving war and heroes. Next one is a volta, which is a turn in thought or argument in poetry. Blank verse, which is a poem is written in blank verse when it is unrhyming, when there's no rhyme scheme, and it's written in iambic pentameter to reflect regular speech. And then iambic pentameter is a line of verse containing 5 iambs, each of which contain 1 unstressed and 1 stressed syllable. I'm going to have a look at all of these in much more detail in the following slides, but you need to get these terms and definitions down for now, so that later on when we talk about them, you know what they mean. Okay, it's really, really important that you're able to understand this key terminology, okay, especially when we're discussing poetry. So pause the video, make those notes, all right? And I'm now going to go on to explore each of these terms in a bit more detail. So first of all, epic poems. So an epic poem is a long narrative poem that is usually about heroic deeds and events that are significant to the culture of the poet, okay? Many ancient writers used epic poetry to tell tales of dramatic events involving war and heroes. They're a lot less common nowadays. They used to be really massive works of art, works of writing done in the past. So for example, here a really famous example of an epic poem, all right, is John Milton's Paradise Lost, which was published in 1667. It's made up of 10 books in total, 10,000 lines of verse. Okay, so this is before they wrote sort of stories and prose as such. Things were sort of written in poetry. The poem contains the biblical story of the fall of man, the temptation of Adam and Eve by the fallen angel Satan and their expulsion from the Garden of Eden. So again, when you think of an epic poem, you can literally think of it as just being epic, all right? We know what the word epic means. It means something's amazing, great, brilliant, fantastic. And we can say the same thing when we describe things as being epic poems. They're these tales of things that are amazing, wonderful, awesome. Again, normally linking to these really big dramatic events and all these people, heroes and whatnot going on. And I say this is an example here where we are looking at that biblical story of the fall of man. Okay, this is one of these dramatic events, and that's what John Milton is describing in this version, okay? And again, this form is going to be significant to us as we move later on, okay? But I just want you to have that awareness of where sort of epic poems come from, what they tend to be about, so that we can link it to the poem later on. Next up, I'm just going to focus it on that idea of a volta a little bit more. So a volta, all right, is the term given to a turn in thought or argument in poetry. It's normally signified by some point in the poem there'll be a shift. All right, it could be with the use of any words, but there'll just be a moment where things change, and it'll be a case of the thoughts and opinions might have changed. The poet might have changed their mind about something, might be thinking about something in a different way. They commonly feature in sonnets, which are a form of poetry that you'll be coming across in the next few poems. All right, but they do feature in other poems. Okay, and you could almost imagine it literally like the speaker doing a U-turn. All right, they've been thinking one thing all the way through, and then all of a sudden they turn and think something else. All right, so again, it's signified by that there is just there'll be a really significant change somewhere when you include a volta in a piece of work. So we'll keep an eye out for that later on. And then finally, I just want to talk a bit about iambic pentameter. I know you've done some work on meter before, especially when you did the Charge of the Light Brigade with dactylic meter. All right, but I'm going to introduce you today to iambic pentameter. You may have heard of this before, but we're just going to go over it again. So iambic pentameter is a line of verse that contains 5 iambs, each of which contain 1 unstressed and 1 stressed syllable. All right, so let's break that phrase down a little bit. So when something is being described as iambic, it means the meter is made up of iambs, okay? And 1 iamb is 1 unstressed syllable and 1 stressed syllable. So if you look at my little squiggly lines down here, this is how syllables are usually represented. When you're annotating poetry to work out what the meter is, you might do it in this way. It'll either be like dot dash or the little line and then the upwards line. All right, and what that's meant to signify is sort of the unstressed syllable, the stressed syllable. So the stressed syllables are the forward dashes. All right, and that's to represent the meter, that's to represent the pattern of text. So 1 unstressed syllable, so 1 dot followed by 1 forward slash is 1 iamb. You've got an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Okay, so that means that if the meter is being described as iambic, it means it contains this pattern where you've got unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. But then looking at the second word, and this is what gives us the clue as to how many iambs feature in the line. Pentameter, think of maths, pentagon, it's got 5 sides. So penta means 5, okay? So what this means, pentameter, is a meter of 5. So then when you look back at the word iambic, means it contains iambs, pentameter, 5 in the meter. So that means you've got 5 iambs in the meter. And I wanted to explain that in a bit more detail because in other poems, we will also come across iambic tetrameter as well as iambic trimeter, I think. All right, and that all refers to mainly how many iambs there are in the lines. And I definitely would come to look at William Blake's London. We'll revisit this again as well. Okay, but iambic pentameter, especially in conjunction with the use of blank verse in this poem, it helps to reflect the pattern of natural speech. Okay, kind of, yeah, and that will be relevant later on. I don't want to reel too much now because we're going to come back to look at this in more detail later on. But I thought I'd give us a little example. So these are the first 3 lines of the poem. I thought I'd include the first clause, so to speak, up to the first full stop, just for us to have a go at how you might read something that's written in iambic pentameter. So again, you've got unstressed syllable followed by stressed syllable 5 times over. The pattern is a bit like this. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. I think that was 5. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. okay? Think of it almost, I always imagine it a little bit as like a horse running along, or as a heartbeat. That's the other way of thinking about it. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. So a small beat, then followed by a bigger one. So if we were to have a go at reading this here, so it's one summer evening led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. But we're going to do a little exercise just to engage a bit more with the meter that is present in these lines. So I want you to join in with me. The pattern, as we know, goes da-dum, 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 da-dum. I always find it handy to be able to clap along when you're trying to identify the meter in any piece of poetry. That's always a really handy thing to do, kind of work out if there is a significant meter and to work out what the meter might be. Right, so I'm going to do it first, and then I want you to join in as well. Okay, get used to the meter here and sort of experience it and reading it aloud and working along with it. So I'll have a go, and then I want you to join in afterwards. I'm going to read it aloud and track the meter as I go. Okay, so one summer evening led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. So you wouldn't normally quite speak like that. Okay, always emphasizing it. I'm doing it just to kind of point out where those emphasized syllables are, and you can see that I've also emboldened the stressed syllables as well. So one summer evening led by her, I found, okay. And again, you wouldn't quite say it like that, always emphasizing that stress syllable, you know, one summer evening led by her, I found. But once you know that where the unstressed and stressed syllables are, you do start to hear it. Okay, so this time round, you're going to do it with me. We're going to clap along. We're going to read along with it. Okay, and it is really good just to practice doing this. Okay, it really helps you to engage and understand the meter. So we're going to clap along again and read along with that. All right, and making sure that we are stressing the stressed syllables and not stressing the unstressed syllables. So ready, in 3, 2, 1. One summer evening led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. Hopefully you joined in with that. If you did, well done. All right. And again, I know that we're emphasizing it there, but that it means when you come back and read it again a bit more normally, you begin to hear that pattern. So if I try and read it a bit more normally now. One summer evening led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. You begin to pick up on that meter, you begin to pick up on that rhythm, and you begin to understand how it does reflect kind of natural speech. That is almost kind of naturally how we talk. Do we all automatically do an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable in our talking? No, but it's the closest thing sort of to our natural rhythm of speech. So hopefully you joined in with that, okay? And we'll come back to talk about this again a little bit later when we look at the poem itself. So moving on to look at the poet then, okay? This is where you're going to want to start making annotations on or around your copy of the poem. William Wordsworth, this guy on the right here. So William Wordsworth is one of the most famous poets in the history of English literature. He was born in Cockermouth in Cumbria, part of the region commonly known as the Lake District, and his birthplace had a huge influence on his writing. He grew up in the countryside, surrounded by all these lakes and various mountains and whatnot. All right, if you know the Lake District at all, it's up north, in the Yorkshire area, I believe, all right, but it's a really large place of nature, essentially. It's important to note as well that Wordsworth had a close friendship with and one of the other Romantic poets, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Together they helped begin the Romantic movement, and the Prelude was dedicated to Coleridge, okay, his writing of this poem, which we'll talk about a bit more now. So the Prelude, a bit of context. The full title of the poem is Extract from the Prelude. This is because the section of the poem that we look at as part of your anthology is literally only one really tiny part of the Prelude as a whole. That's why it's called Extract from the Prelude. This is simply a small extract of the Prelude, which it is itself 14 books long. How big each of these books are, I'm not quite sure, but it's a very vast poem. Or I think back to what I was saying about with Paradise Lost, and it eventually, essentially just being this absolutely massive poem that goes on forever, sort of telling this story. And it was published in 1799, which frames it very, very nicely to be involved as within the Romantic era. Okay, as I was saying earlier, sometimes some of the Romantic poets did fall slightly outside of that 1800 to 1850, but if we're considering Wordsworth as being one of the beginners of the Romantic movement, it makes sense that it features slightly beforehand. The book that this extract features from is called Introduction, Childhood and School Time. So it's when Wordsworth is reflecting back on his own childhood and the experiences that he had. And it is a romantic poem, okay? It explores the relationship between man and the way human identity and experience is shaped by experience, okay? By the things that you do. So what's the poem about? Let's work that out together, okay? We're going to read through the poem, and I want you to write some notes that summarize what happens. As I said, a copy of the poem has been linked on show my homework. All right, but we're aiming for a bit more independence here. So we're going to read through it. It's up to you how you read through it. You might want to grab your own copy, read through it yourself. You might want to listen to me read to it. You might want to look on YouTube and find someone else reading it. It's entirely up to you, but I would highly recommend you listen to it, whether it's, again, me reading, someone else reading, you reading it aloud. All right, with poetry, although obviously it's good fun to read it in your head, I think it's very important to be able to read it aloud and hear it aloud as well, to sort of fully understand. Obviously with poetry, often punctuation and things like that have been used on purpose, and reading aloud allows you to, you know, pause when needed or emphasize when needed, which can really add to your understanding of the poem. So again, it's up to you how you listen to it, but I would recommend that you just hear it aloud in some form, but I'm going to go for it. One summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. Straight I unloosed her chain, and stepping in pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on, leaving behind her still on either side, small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. But now, like one who rose, proud of his skill to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the horizon's utmost boundary. Far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily, I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. When from behind that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. With trembling oars I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. There in her mooring place I left my bark, and through the meadows homeward I went, in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle for many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. Over my thoughts there hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea, or sky, no colours of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, moved slowly through the mind by day and were a trouble to my dreams. Okay, so remember your task was to just write some notes, a couple of sentences maybe, just to kind of summarise what happens. You know, you might want to take the poem section by section, or look at the previous slide and then look back at this one. Right, but I would like you to write down your own notes of what this is happening in this poem. I have put some of the keywords on the screen there. That's available on both slides for any words that you don't understand or you're not sure what they are. Absolutely fine if that's the case. You might want to make a note on your copy of the poem of any of these words that you're not already familiar with, just for reference later on. But pause the video here, have a go at summarising what's happening in that poem yourself, and then I will go through it afterwards. Okay, hopefully by now you've managed to have a go at coming up with your own summary for the poem. So let's talk about this then. What is the poem about? So the speaker, the poet, all right, which we can say is William Wordsworth, takes a boat from a small cove and rows out into a lake. Initially, everything is quiet, but then a huge mountain appears in view, causing the speaker to have a sublime experience. Remember, sublime, all right, you're considering things to be of great excellence or beauty, or often, you know, being in awe of things that are happening. The poem ends with the speaker returning the boat to the cove and then describing the effect that the experience had on him. What effect that was, we shall discuss in more detail at a later time, okay? But that's a really just brief summary of what's happening in the poem, and you can trace that through the poem itself. So if you weren't quite sure what was happening beforehand and now you've read this, maybe look back at the poem now and look at how I've described it, and you can kind of match up what is happening, okay? It's just really a good, with it being such a large poem, that you understand kind of what's happening and where you're able to recognise that. The themes that are featured in the poem, one of the key themes here is going to be the power of nature. Remember, we're looking at power and conflict poetry. We've done a lot of poems on conflict with regards to war, but we are focusing very heavily on power here, and again, specifically the power of nature. We're also looking at loss or absence, memory, pride, and individual experience. Okay, memory, that's really obvious from the fact that it's William Wordsworth, that, you know, this poem was written about his previous life, so he's reflecting on prior experiences. Pride will become more evident as we move to language. And again, individual experience. This poem is designed to explore the ways in which nature is powerful and how this can have an impact on man. William Wordsworth is talking about this experience that he had. Right, so again, we're looking at individual experience, but it's all going to be funneling back to looking at the power of nature with this poem. Pause, annotate, carry on when you're ready. I shall move on. So next we're going to look at the form of the poem, okay? Remember, the form of the poem is the style in which the poem is written. Is it a sonnet? Is it a dramatic monologue? Does the rhyme scheme link in or signify what kind of form it might be? We're considering the features of the poem in its entirety. Now, we know that some poets choose to adopt a particular form, but others do not. And I will tell you now that this poem does have a particular form. All right, which we're now going to try and look for. So, but again, when it comes to form, the things we need to consider: does the poem have a particular form? How does it link to the ideas or message of the poem? If the poem does not have a particular form, why might this be significant? But we don't need to worry about that because this poem does have a significant form. So some questions for you to pause and consider. What might the form of the poem be, considering what it is about? Considering what I've told you about in this lesson so far and how this is only a very small part of the poem as a whole. What might the form of the poem be? A little clue there. Look back at today's key terminology. What form might it be taking? And you might want to use more than one of those words from the key terminology that you got earlier on, but I want you to work this out. And then the second question there, how might this form link to the purpose of the poem being to explore the power of nature over man? Once you've identified what the form is and what that form was generally used for in previous examples, how might Wordsworth's decision to use this form for this poem link to that purpose of the poem being to explore the power of nature over man? Pause, contemplate, have a think, see if you can figure it out. Play again when you're ready to look through some of the answers. Okay, looking at some answers. So the form, it is an epic poem, okay? We talked about it earlier on, and it is written in blank verse. So those are two things to recognise with regards to the form of the poem. So yeah, Extract from the Prelude is an epic poem written in blank verse. Usually epic poems are used to tell dramatic tales about war and heroes. However, in this poem, the form is being used to describe ordinary events, okay? Nothing particularly, exciting is going on, nothing particularly dramatic per se, all right? But this helps to reinforce how dramatic the event is for the speaker. Or all of a sudden he sees this mountain sort of come out of nowhere. And to the speaker, this individual experience is really, really very dramatic, okay? No, it doesn't involve wars and heroes and, big exciting fights and victories and whatnot. It is just about one person's experience. But again, this helps to reinforce how dramatic the event is for the speaker, reflecting the power that nature is having over him, okay? Remember, this poem is all about the effect that nature is having on the individual. It reinforces that the speaker is having a sublime experience. They're finding themselves in awe at the great excellence and beauty of what they find in front of them, as he finds himself in awe of the mountain. And the writing of the poem in blank verse with the use of iambic pentameter, like we talked about, mirrors regular speech, which highlights how this is an individual's experience that is being described. He's kind of trying to tell you a story. He's trying to share this experience with the reader, okay? You do need to make annotations here. You don't need to write everything I've put down word for word, right? But you need to get the key ideas down in a way that you understand and you can refer back to again. But say the key thing to remember here is that this form is being used to take an almost very ordinary, very plain event and make it something epic. All right, again, to reflect the power that nature is having on the individuals. Pause, annotate, carry on when ready. I'm going to move on. So next then we need to look at the structure of the poem, and remember the structure refers to the organisation of the poem on the page. Form, we're looking at the poem as a whole. Structure, we're looking at the layout of the words, and when we come to language, it's when we look at the actual words themselves. So for here, we need to consider the organisation of the poem on the page. We need to look at the number of stanzas, line length, who's the narrator, the rhythm, enjambment, lists, repetition, caesura. Not all of these will feature in every poem, but many of them will pop up. We're not looking at the words themselves as much as how they appear. And questions to consider when it comes to structure. Does the way the poem appears on the page link to its meaning? How might the number of stanzas or stanza length or the length of the lines be important? Is there a rhyme scheme? Is the rhyme scheme regular or varied? How does all of this information link back to the poem or the main ideas of the poems? And what is the rhythm and meter? We've already talked about that. So here are some questions for you to consider now about this poem. So I'll tell you that this extract of the poem is one long stanza. There are no stanza breaks, right? It's all one piece of writing. What effect might this have on the reader is my question for you. So now knowing what the poem is about and now knowing what the poet is experiencing within the poem, what effect do you think the fact that it's all written in one really big chunk, what effect might this have on the reader? And just go with your own thoughts, okay? I want you to come up with an answer, all right? Whether you think you might be right or wrong, okay? It's always better to try and formulate something, but say one massive, great big chunk of information being given to the reader at once. What effect might this have on the reader? And then some other things for you to find. Can you find examples of enjambment, repetition, and a volta? A volta does feature in this poem. If you need to remind yourself of what a volta is, go back and look at your key terminology. Similarly with enjambment and repetition, if you need a reminder, go back to your glossary. But can you find any examples of those three? And then I also want you to consider, what effect does the inclusion of these devices have? Now, we've seen these devices, especially enjambment and repetition, appear in other poems before, and we've talked about them having a very particular effect. So you might want to try and apply some of that knowledge from prior poems over to this one, but I do want you to consider that question. What effect does the inclusion of these devices have? Okay. Pause here, answer the questions on the screen, see what you can find. You don't have to write anything down just yet, but I do want you to think about it, and I'll talk about it a bit more in just a moment. Moving on then. So the structure of the poem has been written as one long stanza, and this overwhelms the reader, okay? It leaves the reader breathless, okay? It's one massive chunk of information, like I was trying to say, kind of being thrown at the reader, like, here is my experience of, you know, an overwhelming nature, all right? We know that the poet is kind of overwhelmed in the poem, especially when that mountain appears, all right? When from behind that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct upreared its head, okay? He was overwhelmed by what nature presented to him, this poet, and he's trying to convey that experience to the reader. And again, one of the ways this is being done is through the fact that it's just one massive stanza of information and description, and so much going on there, just kind of thrown at the reader, and the reader kind of goes, whoa. But even when you're reading it aloud as well, okay, and this will come in handy when we start to think about enjambment, but there's so much going on, you're trying to say it, you know, especially if you're trying to read it aloud, it can leave the reader a bit breathless because there is just so much going on, it just continues. And this overwhelming aspect reflects how Wordsworth himself was overwhelmed by his experience with nature. Again, Wordsworth is our speaker here. He is the speaker within the poem. But this helps the reader to empathise with the speaker and understand what the speaker was going through. If we can kind of experience that sense of being overwhelmed and kind of being left breathless by the sight in front of us, in the same way that Wordsworth was left feeling that way by the scene in front of him, we're left feeling that way by the poem itself. And because we can experience that same feeling, we are able to then empathise with the reader and say, understand what they were going through. Pause, annotate, carry on when you're ready, but I shall move on. The next thing I'm going to look at is the poet's use of enjambment. Okay, so we've got a few examples of enjambment here. I don't think I've quite pointed them out more, but just some of the more obvious ones. All right, so you might want to point these out similarly. All right, but Wordsworth's use of enjambment contributes to the overwhelming nature of the poem, as the reader is forced to move from line to line, each of which contains more information. All right, so like I just said, when you're reading the poem aloud, because of this use of enjambment, you're kind of forced to just carry on speaking. If I look to this bit down here, the last bit that I've pointed out down here, if I start from the "and" here, and through the meadows homeward went in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle for many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. My thoughts that hung a darkness, call it solitude of blank desertion. Several lines that just run on and on and on. All right. And again, it kind of links to that overwhelming nature of the poem and the fact that there's just more and more going on. But again, it's to reflect the overwhelming sensation that the poet had in the experience that he's describing in the poem. And this use of enjambment also illustrates how eager the speaker is to share their experience with the reader there, all right? He's wanting to share, and this is why he's written the poem. This is why we're now able to read it. And Wordsworth wanted to share this experience that he had. And again, that use of enjambment, the rolling over, almost tripping over himself to tell us what's going on, does reinforce as well, just, you know, again, how eager they were to talk and share what they went through. Pause, annotate, carry on when you're ready, but I shall move on. The next thing I'm going to look at is the inclusion of a volta in this poem, okay? And you should remember back from looking at the key terminology, the volta is a turn in perspective or argument. And I pointed it out here. So in one way, we could consider this poem as almost a poem of two halves. The volta occurs here, okay, when we get this term when. All right, what I might do is I might read through the poem again, just so it becomes really obvious that you have this shift in tone. All right. Just up to here, just so you can kind of see that it changes. So I'll quickly do that. One summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. Straight Iron loosed her chain and stepping in pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on, leaving behind her still on either side, small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. But now, like one who rose, proud of his skill to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the horizon's utmost boundary. Far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake. And as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. When, from behind that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars. And still, all right, I'll just stop there. But the reason I've done that is just to kind of signify, especially once you know the Volta is there, just how that word when there is being used to signify this turn, this shift, okay, in what's happening in the poem. Because this word when here, this is the turning point in the poem where the poet reveals the huge mountain beyond the craggy steep. All right, if we look over here, and we'll look at this in more detail when we look at language, but it considers this craggy ridge to be the horizon's utmost boundary. He thinks that's the furthest you can go on the horizon when all of a sudden this appears, okay? This is the climax of the poem. The poet is realizing there is more to the scene than he thought. All right, again, like I just said, he thought that the craggy ridge was it. That was as far as nature went and he could sit there and appreciate it. But no, there is more to the scene than he thought, more beyond the original endpoint, okay? He's been rowing along, seeing this little craggy ridge going, oh, this is nice, this is nature. He then sort of turns the corner and sees this massive mountain that he did not expect, okay? And again, this is the climax of the poem, the poet kind of coming into view of this, you know, giant of nature, so to speak. So again, this is the climax of the poem. The poet is realizing there is more to the scene than he thought, more beyond the original endpoint. And this kind of acts as a metaphor representing how man's ideas about the world are wrong and limited, reiterating the power of nature. So again, if you're kind of seeing it metaphorically, you've got the man in his boat and he's looking out at the craggy ridge and he thought, that's it, that, you know, I know everything about nature because I know that that's the endpoint and I can see everything within it. He then kind of turns the corner and suddenly sees this giant mountain that he did not expect to see. What he has found is something beyond his expectations. He has found something that he didn't know existed, so to speak. So it's something that has gone beyond his expectations and beyond his limitations as well, okay? He was limited by the fact that he thought the craggy ridge was it. But there is so much more out there, and this is kind of what Wordsworth is trying to say. Again, to represent how man's ideas about the world are wrong and limited, reiterating the power of nature. This is one of the really massive themes that runs through the romanticism, romantic poetry, is the fact that we cannot fully comprehend, you know, nature. The planet is nature. We're kind of visitors on it, you know. And this idea of the power of nature will feature once over and over again as we move through some more of the poems. But that's just one of the key ideas we need to be acknowledging here. Pause, annotate, carry on when you're ready, but I'm going to move on to the last part of structure. So the last thing I wanted you to look for was Wordsworth's use of repetition, okay? And this is one of the most obvious examples of repetition within the poem here. Just after the Volta occurs, when the change and the shift in tone happens. Oh, I feel like I should also say just very quickly, when I did say that this one was the poem of two halves where you have the Volta, it'll be interesting when we come to look at language to kind of see how Wordsworth's use of language changes between the first half on the left here and the second half of the poem in the middle here, okay? Once that Volta happens, all right, everything was quite cheery and quite lovely in the first half, and then we move into the second half, things turn a bit darker. But again, that becomes more obvious when we look at language, where I did want to explain that in a bit more detail briefly. Again, repetition though. So just after the Volta has occurred here, when from beyond that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound a huge peak, black and huge. You've got the repetition of the word huge here. And I know we've talked about repetition like this beforehand, I believe when we looked at bayonet charge. This is an example, you know, huge isn't the best adjective to be describing something that's really big. And at the same time, it's been repeated twice. And normally as an English teacher, if somebody was to do that, I might turn to you and say, let's think of another word rather than repeating ourselves twice over. But in this instance, it's on purpose, okay? The poet has chosen to use this word twice in quick succession in purpose. And let's look at the explanation as to why. So the repetition of the adjective huge in quick succession again reinforces how overwhelmed the poet is by this view. He is unable to come up with any other words to describe it in this moment. If you think back to, again, bayonet charge, when the word raw was used a couple of times over, it was linking to the indescribable nature of war in that example, that the speaker couldn't come up with any other words to describe it because it was so indescribable. We've got a similar thing going on here. All right, the poet is unable to do it justice in describing it. Okay, it's something that's so overwhelming and he's so in awe of it, and you know that nature is having such a powerful effect on him that he's struggling to come up with the words. to actually describe it in more detail. It's just the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge. It's so overwhelmed. He can't describe it in any more words than that. He's saying what he's seeing, but he can't be any more elaborate. Okay. So again, almost an indescribable thing being described there with that use of repetition. Blue, annotate. Cloud, pause, annotate. Okay, once again, you don't have to write it in every single word that I do, but you need to get the main point down in a way that you can understand and come back to at a later date. Pause, do that, move on when you're ready. That was it for form and structure for today. If you do find yourself with some time left for today, or you want to do a bit of this in your extracurricular time, I would heavily recommend spending some time creating some self-quizzing questions based on the content of this lesson to aid in your revision. I'm fully aware you have 15 poems to tackle as we look through the Power and Conflict anthology. And obviously, we're going to need to be working on those revision techniques, all right? And it's not just for this, it could be for any subject, just to aid you in that long-term retention and keeping things moving in your brain, all right? The whole purpose of self-quizzing is by asking yourself the question, okay, you're asking your brain to pull the information from the back of your brain back to the forward, all right? And it helps to strengthen those connections and helps to strengthen, you know, whether or not you know it, basically. It strengthens, means you're more likely to remember it for longer if you keep revisiting it like that. So even if it's only a few questions, maybe just about a few things that you weren't quite sure on while I was talking, some things that you know you might forget, all right? I think it's always worth doing if you have some time to dedicate to it. But otherwise, that is it for today. Today we looked at the extract from the Prelude, part 1. Today's aims were to understand some contextual details about the poet, done, to understand what the poem is about, also done, and then to explore the form and structure of the poem, which we have just done in detail. Tomorrow we will move on to do part 2 of this poem, where we will be looking at language. I hope you have left lots of space on your sheets for annotations, because it is a larger poem, one of my favourite ones, I would say though, which means there are likely to be lots of notes when it comes to language. But that's it for today. Well done for sticking with it, all right, and I will leave you to it, and I will see you again for your next lesson tomorrow. Take care.